An elderly man is placed in a nursing home when his adoptive son finds out. No one imagined his reaction. It was a cold and silent night on the outskirts of San Antonio. Mr. Thomas, a humble man with calloused hands and a back bent from years of working the land, was returning home after a long day of labor on his plot. The moon barely illuminated the dirt path that led to his modest adobe house, surrounded by lonely hills. Upon arriving, something strange caught his attention. A soft crying broke the silence of the night, coming from the entrance. He stopped, perplexed, and quickened his pace. As he approached the door of his house, he found a small wooden box. The crying was coming from inside. Mr. Thomas, with his heart racing, knelt and opened the box. Inside, wrapped in a ragged blanket, was a baby of only a few months, crying from cold and hunger. His large, dark eyes met those of Mr. Thomas, who felt a lump in his throat. The man froze for a few seconds, trying to process what he saw. When he picked up the baby in his arms, a letter fell from the blanket. It was a brief handwritten note that read, "Forgive me, brother. I had no other choice. Take care of my son. Don't let him find out." The signature was Clara, his sister. Mr. Thomas felt the world crumble beneath his feet. He knew what had happened with Clara. She had escaped months ago, fleeing from her partner, Javier, a cruel and troubled man. He knew Clara was pregnant, but never imagined she would reach the point of having to leave her own child to save him. With a heart full of anguish, he entered the house and laid the baby on the table. His hands trembled as he reread the letter. Javier must be looking for them, and if he found them, Mr. Thomas didn't want to imagine what that man was capable of. Clara had fled to protect the baby, but now he was at a crossroads. The promise to his sister was clear. He had to take care of the child. Alexander, he thought, recalling the name Clara had mentioned in previous letters before disappearing. Mr. Thomas knew what he had to do, even though his heart weighed heavy with the decision. He would raise that child as if he were his own, without revealing the truth to anyone. The danger was too great. If Javier found them, it wasn't just the baby's life at stake, but also that of his entire family. It would be best to keep the secret even from his wife, Maria, and their 6 biological children. Gently, he cradled little Alexander, trying to soothe him. As he did, he thought of the difficulties he would face. He could barely manage the needs of his 6 children. The plot didn't always yield enough, and some days he and Maria had to go hungry so the kids could eat. But looking into the eyes of that helpless baby, he knew he had no choice. This child was part of his blood, part of his story. Hours passed, and finally the baby stopped crying, falling asleep in Mr. Thomas's arms. The man, exhausted but determined, took him to the room where his other children slept and laid him in an improvised crib. Mr. Thomas's sacrifice to raise all his children consumed him, working from dawn to dusk, often without eating, just to ensure none went hungry or stopped studying. But as Mr. Thomas's biological children grew, things began to change. Despite the difficulties, Mr. Thomas always showed a special affection for Alexander, something that didn't go unnoticed by the other 6. Rumors began to arise in the town, small doubts planted in the minds of the older children. Why did Alexander always seem to receive more attention? Why did Mr. Thomas sacrifice so much for him? The seeds of resentment began to germinate. Alexander, unknowingly, was at the center of a storm he hadn't asked for, a storm that would forever change the fate of the Hernandez family. The days on the plot were long and exhausting. Before dawn, Mr. Thomas was already up, plowing the land with his hands while the sun barely lit up the horizon. Each day was a battle against nature, the weather, and hunger, but his heart remained steadfast. He knew that if he didn't do it, no one else would. His family depended on him, Alexander and his 6 biological children, and that was the only thing that gave him strength to move forward. Over time, little Alexander had grown up as one more among his siblings, although there was always that slight tension in the air that no one dared to name. Mr. Thomas carried not only the responsibility of feeding them, but also the secret that tormented him. How long could he hide the truth? One morning, while Mr. Thomas prepared the plow, his wife Maria approached him, wiping her hands on her apron. Although she was always quiet and patient, This time, her gaze hid a mix of fatigue and worry. "Tommy, we've given everything we have to these children, but we can barely manage with what we earn. The boys are growing. They eat more, need more things. I don't know how we'll manage this year." Mr. Thomas remained silent, his sweaty and bent back looking at the dry land before him. He knew Maria was right, but there was no room for complaints. Times were hard. As the children grew, their needs increased. But inside him, something hurt more than those daily difficulties. He knew that part of the burden was heavier because of Alexander. Alexander had always been a quiet child, more thoughtful than the others. He didn't ask for much, but Mr. Thomas felt a special responsibility towards him, as if in some way his sacrifice for this child were greater than for the others. This made him work twice as hard, silently holding back his own needs and pains. There was one day that remained etched in Mr. Thomas's memory as one of the most difficult of his life. Alexander, who was about 7 years old at the time, fell gravely ill. He had a fever so high that he couldn't stop shaking, and his little hands were as cold as ice. Mr. Thomas tried to calm him with home remedies, but nothing worked. The town doctor, when he visited them, was clear. Alexander needed expensive medicine, and if they didn't act quickly, the child could die. Mr. Thomas's heart sank. He looked around the small house he had built with his hands, knowing there was no money, not enough to save Alexander. That night, with worry gnawing at him from within, he decided he would do the unthinkable. He walked to the old trunk he kept in a corner of the house, where the little that remained of his family's inheritance was stored, a gold chain and a ring, both mementos of his parents. They were objects of great sentimental value, but also the only things he could sell to raise the necessary funds. Maria watched him from the corner of the room, her face pale. "Tommy, are you going to sell that? It's the last thing we have." Her voice was filled with anguish, but he knew there was no other option. "It's to save him," he replied, with a firmness that tried to hide the pain in his chest. "I can't let the boy die." With a broken heart, Mr. Thomas sold the last memories of his family. The money barely covered the medicine and a few groceries. That week, he and Maria didn't eat, devoting everything to Alexander's recovery. And it worked. The boy slowly came back to life, regaining his energy and smile. But that sacrifice left a mark on Mr. Thomas. From that moment, things changed. Between him and his wife, Maria, they never spoke of it directly, but the distance between them grew. The other children, though too young to understand the magnitude of what had happened, also began to notice something. The special favor that Mr. Thomas showed towards Alexander was no secret. Why did Dad always do more for Alexander? That was the question the other children began to ask silently, even though they all ate the same bread and lived under the same roof. There was something in the relationship between Mr. Thomas and Alexander that the others noticed. But Mr. Thomas tried hard to be fair. He never denied his children what they needed or showed favoritism openly. However, the fact that Alexander had been saved with the last sacrifice of the family began to sow small seeds of resentment among the other children, although none expressed it openly. The years continued to pass, and with each harvest, life became more difficult for Mr. Thomas. He worked more, ate less, his hands aged faster than his body. His bones creaked under the weight of the years and the emotional burden of his secret. Sometimes in the loneliest nights, he wondered if he had done the right thing by hiding the truth. If someday Alexander should know the story of his true mother and the man who had driven her to flee. But as Alexander grew strong and full of life, Mr. Thomas knew there was no turning back. He had made a vow, and he would fulfill it to the end, even if it meant bearing the weight of the truth alone. More than 15 years had passed since that cold night when Mr. Thomas found Alexander on his doorstep, abandoned by Clara, his sister. The days in the field continued with the same harshness as always, but something in the atmosphere seemed to have changed. Alexander was no longer a child. He had become a strong young man with keen eyes and hands as weather as his father's. However, there was something more in him, a growing restlessness, a desire to understand his place in the world. Alexander had always been observant, much more than his siblings. He was not the kind of young man who accepted half-hearted answers. From time to time, he would ask about his mother, but Mr. Thomas always dodged the topic, steering the conversation towards work in the field or daily chores. "Your mother was a great woman, but she left many years ago," he would say, his voice laden with a sadness that Alexander never fully understood. That afternoon, while Alexander was working alone in the stables, Mr. Thomas watched from a distance, a mix of pride and guilt stirring in his stomach. Alexander had grown so much. His bearing and the way he moved reminded him so much of Clara that every time he saw him, the past returned with more force. But it was different now. Something in Alexander's eyes indicated that his curiosity was increasing, and that terrified him. Alexander sensed that something was amiss. Mr. Thomas's affection towards him had always been evident, but there was also a kind of uncomfortable silence when they spoke of his origins. He knew it, and with time that doubt grew like a shadow, a question he couldn't bring himself to ask directly. That afternoon, while Mr. Thomas was returning home after a long day of work, an unexpected figure appeared in the distance, walking towards the entrance of the town. It was a tall man with a disheveled appearance, wearing a hat that partially concealed his face. He carried a ragged bag slung over his shoulder, and his worn-out boots left marks on the dry dust of the road. This man was Javier. Nearly 2 decades had passed since the last time Mr. Thomas had seen him, but he recognized him instantly. A chill ran down his spine as he saw him approach. Time had been cruel to Javier. His face was more haggard, with deep lines of worry and exhaustion etched on it. But his eyes, those eyes that Mr. Thomas remembered, were still the same, cold, calculating, filled with a contained fury. When Javier finally reached the entrance of the town, he stopped in front of Mr. Thomas's house, his presence radiating a tension that seemed to saturate the air. "What are you doing here?" asked Mr. Thomas, his voice tense, though he tried to remain firm. His mind was filled with memories he preferred not to evoke. He thought of Clara, of her pain, of how she had fled from this man. He couldn't allow Javier to ruin what he had built with so much effort. The past had to remain buried. Javier smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. There was something in his gaze that made Mr. Thomas feel a weight in his chest. "I'm looking for something that belongs to me," said Javier, his tone icy and direct. "I've heard that Alexander lives here with you." The last word, "you," rolled off his tongue like poison. Mr. Thomas felt his blood boil. The secret he had kept for so many years was about to be exposed. Alexander could not find out this way, not from the mouth of a man like Javier. However, he couldn't prevent his mind from returning to those early days when he had decided to protect the child at all costs. How could he protect Alexander now that Javier had returned? "Alexander is not your concern," replied Mr. Thomas, standing in front of the door of his house, blocking Javier's path. "He is my son!" The words were firm, but there was a tremor inside him that he couldn't control. Javier let out a bitter laugh, the sound slicing through the air like a knife. "Your son? Don't fool yourself, Thomas. You know as well as I do that he is not yours. It is my blood that runs through his veins, and I came to claim what is mine." "Claim what?" asked Mr. Thomas, trying to contain the rage building inside him. "You never cared about Clara, let alone Alexander. You are not a father." Javier's face tensed at the mention of Clara. He was a man filled with regrets, though he wouldn't admit it. Deep down, he knew he had lost Clara due to his own fault, due to his inability to change. But he was not willing to admit it. Not to Mr. Thomas, and even less to Alexander. In his mind, he still had a right to that boy, even if he didn't really know what he would do if he had him by his side. "I'm not here to ask for your permission," Javier continued, taking a step closer until his face was just inches from Mr. Thomas's. "I'm here to reclaim what is mine. Alexander deserves to know who his true father is." Javier's words were like a punch to the stomach. Mr. Thomas didn't respond immediately. He knew that this moment would come sooner or later, but he had hoped he would be the one to tell the truth. Now, with Javier standing in front of his house, threatening to reveal everything, he felt the control he had fought so hard to maintain fading away. Finally, Mr. Thomas stepped back, looking at Javier with a mix of desperation and determination. I'll tell you one last time, Javier. Leave. Alexander is not yours. He never was and never will be. Javier remained still for a moment, assessing the situation. His smile faded, replaced by a darker and more dangerous look. We will see each other soon, Thomas. This is not over. And without saying more, he turned around and walked away, leaving behind a heavy air of uncertainty and threat. Mr. Thomas stood still, watching as Javier disappeared down the path. He knew his return was not a coincidence. Javier was not a man of empty words, and that worried him deeply. He had to protect Alexander at all costs, but time was running out. The secret he had kept for so many years was about to be revealed, and he wasn't sure if Alexander would be ready to learn the truth. That night, Mr. Thomas could barely sleep. The past was returning with more force than he had imagined, and soon the whole family would feel the consequences. Weeks passed since the unsettling appearance of Javier at Mr. Thomas's door. Although that encounter had not been witnessed by anyone else, the atmosphere in the home became thick and silent, as if the tension had seeped into the adobe walls. Mr. Thomas knew that Javier had not returned to remain still, and that thought kept him on alert, his heart in suspense every time Alexander went out. Mr. Thomas feared that Javier would appear to tell him his version of the truth. For his part, Alexander also sensed that something was wrong, since that day when he noticed Mr. Thomas more distracted and more worried. He felt that something was about to change. The old man who had raised him seemed to be avoiding the more important conversations, always hiding behind matters of the field or family responsibilities. Alexander, now a young man of good stature, knew that there were unanswered questions, but feared what those answers might reveal. One afternoon, while Alejandro was loading tools in the barn, he decided he could no longer ignore the elephant in the room. He had spent his life working alongside Mr. Thomas and his siblings, but there was always that invisible barrier between him and the rest of the family. It was as if, despite everything, he had never fully belonged. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with his shirt sleeve and dropped the tools into the dusty ground, his gaze fixed on the figure of Mr. Thomas, who, in the distance, was fixing a fence with hands trembling from exhaustion. The time had come to confront the man who had raised him. "Dad," Alexander said, his voice firm but laden with contained emotions. Mr. Thomas looked up, surprised by his son's tone. The word "dad" felt different this time, as if it carried a greater burden. Alexander approached, wiping his dirt-covered hands on his pants. "I need to talk to you," he said, stopping a few steps away from his father. "There's something you haven't told me. I've felt it my whole life, and I can't keep pretending that nothing is happening. I want to know the truth." Mr. Thomas felt the air escape his lungs. There it was, the moment he had dreaded since the day he took Alexander into his arms. He looked at his son, who was no longer a child, and understood he could no longer postpone the inevitable. Alexander had the right to know the truth, but Mr. Thomas feared that by revealing it, the bond they had built over the years would be broken forever. "What are you talking about, son?" Mr. Thomas asked, his voice trembling, although he knew perfectly well what Alexander was referring to. The young man looked at him with a mix of sadness and frustration. "I'm not stupid, Dad," Alexander replied with a tired sigh. "I've always felt that there was something different about me. I'm not like the others. I've noticed it in how you look at me, in how you care for me in a way you don't with my siblings. And when I was younger, I heard people in town murmuring behind my back. I want you to tell me the truth because I feel like I don't fully belong to this family." Mr. Thomas felt the ground beneath his feet shake. Everything he had tried to protect was about to crumble. He looked into Alexander's eyes, the same eyes that had looked at him that night when he found him on the doorstep, and knew there was no way to hide it any longer. The truth had to come out. "Alexander," he began, his voice breaking with emotion, "you have always been my son. I raised you as one of my own. I gave you everything I could, the best of what I had in me. But there's something I haven't told you, and it's because I wanted to protect you." Alexander stood still, not breaking eye contact with his father. He knew the truth was about to be revealed, but he couldn't imagine what he was about to hear. "You didn't come from me or from Maria," Mr. Thomas continued, feeling that each word tore a piece of his soul. "You are the son of my sister Clara." The name of his biological mother fell like a bomb in Alexander's ears. "She left you under my care when you were just a baby. She fled from a dangerous man, Javier, your biological father. She wanted you to grow up far from him, in peace, without knowing of his existence." Alexander took a step back, feeling the world around him spin out of control. "My mother," he murmured, almost breathless. "So Javier is my father?" Mr. Thomas nodded slowly, unable to say more. He saw it in Alexander's eyes: confusion, betrayal, pain. "Your mother died shortly after leaving you with me," Mr. Thomas said. "I did what she asked. I raised you as one of my children because that's what Clara wanted. But Javier, he is not a good man, Alexander. And now he has returned." Alexander's face changed completely upon hearing those words. Javier, the man he had barely seen out of the corner of his eye in town a few weeks ago, was his biological father. The revelation hit him hard like a punch to the stomach. Alexander felt a mix of anger and sadness, a whirlwind of emotions he couldn't control. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" exclaimed Alexander, taking another step closer to Mr. Thomas, his voice laden with reproach. "My whole life, Dad. My whole life I felt there was something off. And you hid it from me." Mr. Thomas tried to reach out with his hand to calm him, but Alexander stepped back, unable to bear the proximity. "I did it to protect you," Mr. Thomas replied, his words filled with pain. "Your mother asked for it. She wanted you to be safe, far from that man, and I did the best I could." "The best you could?" replied Alexander, tears in his eyes. "And what about me? Did I not have the right to know who I truly am? You took away the possibility of knowing my story. Now everything is upside down, and I don't even know who I am." Mr. Thomas didn't know what else to say. Everything he had feared for years was happening before his eyes. Alexander looked at him as if he were a stranger. The bond they had built for so long was breaking as the truth came to light. "I need time," murmured Alexander, his voice breaking. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this." And without saying more, he turned around and began to walk towards the field, leaving Mr. Thomas alone with a broken heart. Mr. Thomas stood watching as his son walked away, knowing there was no turning back. Alexander was no longer the child he had raised, and he feared he would never be the same again. The shadow of the past had fallen upon them, and the relationship he had valued so much was crumbling before his eyes. That night, Mr. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, alone with his head in his hands. The house, which had always been a place of refuge and love, now felt empty and cold. The price of the truth was high, and he was paying for it with his own family. The days became long and heavy in Mr. Thomas's life after the confrontation with Alexander. The weight of silence was unbearable. Although they continued living under the same roof, Alexander barely exchanged words with him, keeping his distance, lost in his own thoughts. They were no longer the same people. The air in the house was charged with tension, and Mr. Thomas felt that every step he took only drove him further away from his adoptive son. Guilt devoured him. He had spent his whole life sacrificing for his children, and now in his old age, Alexander's resentment and the indifference of the other children were beginning to take their toll. The hands that had once been strong and firm now trembled. His back, always bent from working the fields, seemed weaker than ever. Mr. Thomas was a man who had given everything he had, and he felt he had nothing left. Alexander, for his part, was immersed in his own internal struggle since discovering the truth about his mother and Javier. A whirlwind of emotions kept him in constant conflict. It wasn't easy to accept that his entire life had been based on a secret. Although he continued working in the fields alongside his brothers, there was a palpable distance between him and Mr. Thomas, an open wound that neither of them knew how to heal. Mr. Thomas's other children, who had grown up without questioning too much about Alexander, also began to notice the tension. "Dad isn't well," murmured the oldest brother, Luke, when he saw Mr. Thomas cough or stop halfway in the field with his hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. But despite those comments, none of them took action. The 6 biological children were more concerned about their own affairs, their families, their jobs, and Mr. Thomas, although he was their father, seemed to have been relegated to the background. One afternoon, Mr. Thomas's body could take no more. He was working alone in the fields, as he usually did, when he felt a sharp pain in his chest. He tried to ignore it, but the pain intensified rapidly. His hands, dirty with soil, gripped the handle of the shovel he was using, trying to remain standing, but his legs began to tremble. He fell to his knees, gasping, his heart pounding inside his chest. The trees surrounding him seemed to move around him, and the clear blue sky became blurry before his eyes. He tried to get up, but his legs wouldn't respond. His entire body trembled, unable to bear the weight of so many years of sacrifice. Alexander was working a short distance away when he heard a dull sound. Turning around, he saw Mr. Thomas on the ground, motionless. Immediately, Alexander ran toward him, his heart in his throat. "Dad!" he cried, his voice breaking as he knelt beside Mr. Thomas. The old man's eyes were half open. His breathing was irregular. Alexander, with trembling hands, tried to lift him, but Mr. Thomas stopped him with a weak gesture of his hand. "No, I can't, son. I can't anymore," he murmured with difficulty. "You have to get up," insisted Alexander, panic cracking his voice. "You can't leave me like this, not after everything that happened. Don't leave me now." His heart pounded as he watched Mr. Thomas struggle for every breath. At that moment, something in Alexander broke. The anger, the resentment he had felt over the past weeks crumbled completely. All that was left was fear. Fear of losing the man who had raised him. The man who, despite everything, had been his father. Tears began to fall down his face as he tightly held Mr. Thomas's hand. "Don't leave me, please," he whispered, as if the words could stop the inevitable. Mr. Thomas, with the little strength he had left, gently squeezed Alexander's hand. He had lived his life in silence, with secrets and sacrifices, and now in his most vulnerable moment, he saw the face of his adoptive son filled with pain. "I did what I could for you, Alexander," he murmured. "I always did it for you." Those words resonated in Alexander like an echo. In that moment, he realized everything Mr. Thomas had done for him. All the work, the sacrifices, the years of effort had been for him, to protect him. Despite the secret, despite the mistakes, Mr. Thomas had always acted out of love. Alexander felt overwhelmed with guilt for having judged him so harshly. "Forgive me," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. I didn't know how much you had done for me. I didn't understand until now." The other children, hearing the commotion, ran toward the field. Luke, Joseph, and the rest arrived just in time to see their father in Alexander's arms. The scene was shocking for them, as although they knew Mr. Thomas was no longer at his best, they had never imagined seeing him so fragile, so close to death. "We have to take him to the doctor," shouted one of the brothers, but Mr. Thomas shook his head, breathing heavily. "No, there's nothing to be done," he murmured with evident effort. "I've lived my life. I did what I had to do." The biological children, who had until then maintained a certain emotional distance from their father, looked at him with eyes full of remorse. They all knew they had not been present as they should have been, each one immersed in their own life, their own problems. They had allowed Mr. Thomas to bear the weight of the family alone, without truly thanking him for everything he had done. That afternoon, they took Mr. Thomas back to the house, their eyes filled with tears and their hearts broken. Alexander never left his side, determined not to repeat the mistake of distancing himself from his father. Mr. Thomas was placed in the old wooden bed where he had slept for decades, surrounded by his children. As his health continued to deteriorate, the man who had once been as strong as an oak was now a shadow of what he had been. In the following weeks, Mr. Thomas could hardly move. His body, exhausted from years of sacrifice, no longer responded. His children cared for him, but resentment and guilt weighed heavily on each of them. Luke and Joseph frequently argued about what to do, whether to take him to the city for treatment or let him rest in peace. The other siblings, confused and scared, didn't know how to deal with the reality of watching their father fade away before their eyes. But Alexander, though broken by the pain, remained firm. He couldn't change the past, but now he knew what he had to do. It was time to set aside resentment and be there for Mr. Thomas, no matter what came. He promised himself he wouldn't leave him alone, not while he still had some strength to support him. The Hernandez household, which had once been a refuge of family warmth, became a place of heavy silences and avoided gazes. Mr. Thomas's health continued to deteriorate, and with it, the tension among his children increased. In the weeks following his collapse, Alexander stood firm beside his father, doing everything he could to care for him, while the biological children struggled between filial duty and their own selfishness. Luke, the eldest, had assumed the natural authority among his brothers. He had always been practical and direct, the most organized and the one who had achieved the most success in his life. Since their father had become gravely ill, Luke tried to take control of the situation. "Dad needs specialized care," he constantly said to his brothers. "Here at home, we can't do anything more for him." Alexander, however, disagreed. Every time the possibility of taking Mr. Thomas to a hospital or a care center was mentioned, the idea horrified him. "We're not going to abandon him," he repeated over and over, with a firmness that surprised his brothers. "He doesn't want to leave his home. We're not going to send him away now, when he needs us more than ever." This difference in opinions began to tear apart what little remained of the family unity. Luke, irritated by Alexander's resistance, began to show signs of frustration every time his adoptive brother spoke up. "You always defend him," he said on one occasion, frowning. "But you don't understand what's at stake. We can't let Dad keep deteriorating here." "And what do you suggest?" replied Alexander, looking at him with a mix of disbelief and anger. "Take him to a hospital where he will be alone, surrounded by strangers? Let him die in a place where we won't even be able to be close to him? No, Luke, that's not what he wants. That's not what he needs." The other brothers watched the dispute in silence, not daring to intervene directly. Each one had their own life, their own problems, and although they felt affection for their father, none were willing to sacrifice too much for him at that moment. Their jobs, their families, and their responsibilities kept them away from home most of the time. In that space, Alexander and Luke became the main contenders for Mr. Thomas's future. Joseph, the second oldest brother, was the one trying to calm the waters, but he too began to show signs of discomfort. "Luke is right about one thing," Joseph said in one of those discussions, his tone soft but serious. "Dad isn't improving here. Maybe in a hospital, they could give him the care he needs." "Care?" replied Alexander, with a hint of bitterness in his voice. "What Dad needs is to be close to us. We can't leave him now. What he needs is our love, not to leave him in the hands of strangers." Luke, increasingly upset, slammed his fist on the table, causing it to echo in the small kitchen. "You can't decide this all by yourself, Alexander. You are not more his son than we are." The words fell heavy, and for a moment, silence filled the room. Alexander felt a knot in his stomach. He knew that although they didn't say it openly, his biological brothers had always felt something towards him. Not for who he was, but for the special place he occupied in Mr. Thomas's heart. And now, at this critical moment, all those emotions that had been buried for years began to rise to the surface. "I'm not," said Alexander, his voice low but firm. "But I was the one who stood by his side all this time. You all left. You made your lives. I don't blame you for that. But now that Dad needs us, we can't leave him alone." The biological siblings looked at each other. Alexander's words cut deep, and though they wouldn't admit it, they knew there was some truth in what he was saying. Luke, however, was not willing to give in. "This isn't about who was here longer," he replied. "It's about what's best for Dad." Days passed, and the tension continued to rise. Mr. Thomas, weaker by the day, noticed the conflict among his children, even though he hardly had the strength to intervene. Sometimes from his bed, he would hear them arguing in the kitchen or in the yard, and it broke his heart. The last thing he wanted was for the family to fall apart because of his fault. But he didn't have the energy to stop what was happening. Alexander took care of most of the caregiving, Although he had no experience in medicine, he did his best, changing the sheets, helping him move, feeding him. Every small gesture was an act of love, but also a desperate attempt to compensate for all the resentment he had once felt toward Mr. Thomas. He wanted his father to know that despite everything, he was there and wouldn't leave him. One afternoon, Luke made a unilateral decision without consulting Alexander. He called a hospital in the city to ask for information about admitting elderly patients. When Alexander found out what he had done, he exploded in anger. "You can't do this without consulting me," he shouted, confronting Luke in the middle of the living room. "Dad doesn't want to go to a hospital, and I'm not going to let you take him away from here as if he were a burden." "Enough, Alexander," replied Luke with contained fury. "You don't have more right than we do to decide what's best for him. This isn't about what you want, it's about what Dad needs." "Dad needs to be in his home," shouted Alexander, losing control. "This is his home. I'm not going to let you take him away from everything he loves." The argument became bitter. Alexander, consumed by the desperation of not wanting to lose Mr. Thomas, and Luke, loaded with a mix of frustration and resentment, began to yell at each other with such intensity that their words reverberated throughout the house. Suddenly, a weak but firm voice interrupted them. "Enough!" Both brothers stood still upon hearing Mr. Thomas from the door of his room. The old man had risen from bed, swaying as he leaned against the doorframe. He was pale, gaunt, but his gaze still held the silent authority that had always characterized him as a father. "I don't want to hear you fight anymore." Alexander and Luke looked at him in shock, both speechless, as Mr. Thomas, with obvious effort, walked toward them. "Don't take me to any hospital," said Mr. Thomas, his voice grave as he stopped in front of his children. "My place is here, in my home. I have lived here all my life, and here I want to stay. I know my time is running out, but I don't want it to end away from you." Luke looked down, feeling guilty for not having listened before. Alexander, with a broken heart, looked at his father, feeling a mix of relief and pain. "It's okay, Dad," he murmured, finally with a voice filled with regret. "We won't take you anywhere. You will stay here." Mr. Thomas sighed as if a great burden had been lifted from his chest. But despite his resolution, the damage was already done. The open wounds between the brothers would not heal so easily, and the tension in the family continued to grow. Mr. Thomas knew this, and it weighed on him more than his own illness. In his room that night, Mr. Thomas lay awake with his eyes fixed on the wooden ceiling. He knew his time was limited, but something still troubled him. Alexander still didn't know the whole truth, and Javier's return was a threat he couldn't ignore. The family he had tried to protect his whole life was on the brink of collapse, and he didn't know how to stop it. The tensions in the Hernandez household continued to grow heavier each day, each conversation more bitter. Alexander could no longer stand it. Although he had done everything possible to care for Mr. Thomas and stay by his side, the constant struggle with his biological siblings, especially with Luke, was wearing him down. What had once been a sacrifice driven by love now felt like a burden he bore alone. He felt like he didn't belong there. No matter how hard he tried, no matter how hard he fought, his siblings continued to see him as an outsider. And the weight of resentment was not only theirs. Within him, Alexander still struggled with the truth about his origins. Javier, his name constantly lingered in his mind, the man who had appeared weeks ago and revealed the dark secret about his true past. Javier was his biological father, and that truth, though he hated it, tormented him silently. That night, Alexander made a decision. The air in the house was dense, and although Mr. Thomas slept in the adjoining room, the young man felt he could not stay any longer. He knew that what he was about to do would be seen as a betrayal, but something inside him pushed him to leave. He needed answers. He needed to know who he really was. The stars shone in the sky as Alexander stepped out into the yard with a small suitcase in hand. The cool night air hit his face, but didn't calm him. "I don't want to leave, but I can't stay," he thought. His brothers were in their rooms, probably asleep or too worried about their own problems to notice what he was doing. As he walked down the dirt path leading to the main road, Alexander felt a pang of guilt. He knew that by leaving the house, he was abandoning Mr. Thomas at his most vulnerable. Before he left, he had written a brief note addressed to his father, leaving it on the kitchen table. The words were few, but enough to explain how he felt. "Dad, I need to find myself. I can't keep living in the shadow of what I don't know. I'll come back, I promise. But now I must go." Every word had been a stab to his heart, but he couldn't face Mr. Thomas directly, not after everything that had happened between them. Alexander kept walking, the sound of his footsteps being his only company in the night. The road led him to an uncertain place, a destination he didn't even fully understand. What he did know was that he needed to find Javier. This man, his true father, had the answers Mr. Thomas had never given him, what Clara had told him, and what kind of man Javier truly was. The memories of the brief conversation with Javier remained fresh in his mind. "I am your father," Javier had told him with an unsettling calm. "You deserve to know the truth." But Mr. Thomas had stopped him before he could continue, cutting off any chance for understanding. Now, the only way to obtain those answers was to confront Javier on his own. The journey was long, and Alexander did not stop. He traveled roads, asked in the small shops of the town, and finally arrived at the inn where Javier was staying. His heart pounded as he approached the door. Although he had made the decision to leave, now that he was about to confront his biological father, he felt a mix of fear and rage. When he knocked, Javier greeted him with a smile that Alexander couldn't interpret. The man invited him in and had him sit in a wooden chair in front of a small table. The place was dark, lit only by a weak lamp, and the smell of tobacco permeated the air. "I knew you would come," said Javier, lighting a cigarette and exhaling the smoke slowly. Sooner or later, children always seek the truth about their parents. Alexander didn't respond immediately. He watched him closely, trying to find in that man some sign of what was in his own soul. But all he saw was a shadow. "Tell me the truth," he finally said, his voice firmer than he expected. "I want to know everything. What happened to my mother? Why did you leave me? Why did you show up now?" Javier smiled again, that twisted smile that Alexander was starting to detest. "Your mother, Clara, was a special woman," he began, setting the cigarette on the edge of the table. "She was strong, but also weak in some ways. We had problems, yes, but I've changed, Alexander. I want to be part of your life now that I know where you are. I want to meet you, to regain lost time." Although his words sounded kind, Javier's tone had something unsettling, something calculating that Alexander couldn't ignore. Alexander stood up from the chair, feeling that everything was wrong. He knew he had come seeking answers, but all he had found was more confusion. "I don't want anything from you," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "You can't just appear and pretend that everything is okay. You can't erase the past. Mr. Thomas, he was the one who raised me, not you." Javier remained still, looking at Alexander with an expression that was difficult to read. "He raised you?" "Yes," he admitted, his voice now colder. "But I am your true father, and you can't change that. Sooner or later, you will return to me." "Alexander, the past always comes back," he said, stepping closer, his fist clenched. "You took him from me. You stole the opportunity for me to be his father. If Clara hadn't fled, Alexander would have been with me. He is mine by right." Alexander then stepped in front of Mr. Thomas and looked directly into the eyes of his biological father. "You are right, Javier," he said calmly. "We share blood, but that doesn't make you my father. A father is someone who raises you, who is there when you need him most, who sacrifices his life to give you the best opportunity. And that was not you, it was Mr. Thomas." Javier's gaze hardened, but Alexander didn't waver. "All this time," he continued, his voice firm but laden with emotions, "I've been searching for answers about who I am, where I come from. I thought being your biological son would explain everything, but now I know that what defines a family isn't blood. It's love and sacrifice. You weren't there for me, nor for Clara, and because of that, you will never be my father." Alexander's words fell like blows on Javier, whose expression shifted from fury to a mix of disbelief and despair. "You can't do this to me," he murmured, his voice quieter and less certain than before. "You can't reject me like this. I am your father." "No, you're not," replied Alexander firmly. "Mr. Thomas is my true father, and he always will be. I suggest you leave because there is nothing for you here." Javier remained still for a moment, as if processing what he had just heard. The twisted smile and the confidence he had shown upon entering the room vanished completely. He realized he had lost not only Alexander, but also any chance of regaining the control he had once believed he had. The man who had returned seeking power and recognition now found himself alone. Finally, he stepped back, defeat evident on his face. "This is not over," he said, although his voice no longer held the strength it once had. "But if you think this old man can give you more than I could, then you are fooling yourself." Alexander looked at him with a mixture of compassion and determination. "I'm not fooled," he replied calmly. "I know exactly who I am, and I know who raised me. That is the only thing that matters." Javier said nothing more. He turned around, slowly walking toward the door, and left the room without looking back. The sound of the door closing behind him was like an echo that resonated in the small space, marking the end of a conflict that had been brewing for years. Alexander then turned to Mr. Thomas, who looked at him with pride and relief in his tired eyes. "I'm sorry, Dad," said Alexander, taking his father's hand again. "I'm sorry for leaving you alone with this. I should have never doubted you." Mr. Thomas smiled softly, his gaze filled with love and understanding. "I never doubted you, son," he murmured. "I knew you would find your way back. You always knew the truth. You just needed time to understand it." Alexander knelt beside his bed, holding Mr. Thomas's hand as a deep peace flooded over him. He had faced his demons, grasped the true meaning of family, and was finally at peace with himself. Mr. Thomas was his father, not by blood, but through the sacrifice, love, and unconditional support he had given him throughout his life. Together, they spent the rest of the afternoon conversing, just like they did in the happy days before the truth about Javier came to light. Alexander promised that he would no longer let the past separate them. Although weak, Mr. Thomas was at peace, knowing he had fulfilled his greatest duty as a father, to give his son the love and truth he deserved. The confrontation with Javier had been the closure of a painful chapter in the lives of both Alexander and Mr. Thomas. The truth had come to light, and Alexander, by rejecting his biological father, had finally found peace in the place where he belonged, beside the man who had raised him with love and sacrifice. However, there were still open wounds in the family. The biological brothers, who for years had lived unaware of Alexander's and Mr. Thomas's emotional conflict, now faced the reality that their father was in his final days and they had not been there. Luke and Joseph in particular felt the weight of guilt. They had made decisions without consulting their father, thinking of his physical well-being, but they had ignored what mattered most, his desire to be surrounded by his family. Both brothers had not visited the nursing home as often as they had promised, and instead, they had let Alexander bear the responsibility of taking care of Mr. Thomas. One afternoon, while Alexander was sitting by Mr. Thomas's bed, reading aloud from one of his father's favorite books, Luke appeared in the doorway, accompanied by Joseph. They had spent days avoiding that moment, knowing they would have to face not only Mr. Thomas, but also Alexander, who had stood firm beside his father while they had stepped back. Alexander looked up when he saw them enter. There was no need for words. The weight of the moment hung in the air, and Luke's and Joseph's eyes were filled with remorse. They knew they had failed, not only as sons, but as a family. "Alexander," began Luke, his voice choked, "we need to talk." Alexander gently closed the book, allowing silence to fill the space for a moment before responding. "Now you want to talk?" he said calmly, but his tone revealed disappointment. "Dad has been here all this time waiting for you. I have too." Luke looked down, unable to bear the weight of guilt in his brother's eyes. "I know we haven't been here as we should have," he admitted. "We thought we were doing the right thing, but now I understand that all Dad wanted was to be with us in his home, not in a place like this." Mr. Thomas, though weak, opened his eyes upon hearing his children's voices. "Luke, Joseph," he murmured, his voice hoarse and choppy. "I always knew you would come back. I don't hold a grudge." Joseph stepped forward, visibly affected. He knelt beside the bed, taking his father's hand carefully. "I'm sorry," he said, tears in his eyes. "I know we made mistakes. We sent you here thinking it was for the best, but it wasn't. We left you alone when all you wanted was to be home." Mr. Thomas smiled weakly, his face etched with the wrinkles of time, but with a peace radiating from within. "What matters is that we are together now," he replied softly. "And we all make mistakes, children. But the most important thing is that we acknowledge them and are willing to correct them." Luke, still standing by the door, watched the scene in silence, feeling small before the man who had given everything for them. He knew deep down that he had allowed emotional distance to grow between them. He had always thought that a son's responsibility was to protect his parents physically, to ensure they had everything they needed. But now he realized that what Mr. Thomas needed more than anything was love, not practical solutions. "Dad," Luke said, his voice broken, "we weren't up to par. Alexander was the one who was here for you, who did what we should have done. And for that, I'm sorry." The words came out with difficulty, but he knew they were necessary. Mr. Thomas looked at him with an expression of deep understanding. "So now you understand," he said. "There's no resentment in my heart. I have always loved you all equally, and that won't change." Alexander observed the scene in silence, feeling a mix of emotions. For a long time, he had believed that his relationship with his brothers was broken, that they would never accept what he meant to Mr. Thomas. But now, seeing them so vulnerable and full of regret, he realized that forgiveness was not only possible, but necessary to heal as a family. "It's not a time for reproaches," Alexander finally said, breaking the silence. "Dad always taught us that family is above all, and if he can forgive you, so will I. The important thing is that we are here now, together." Luke and Joseph nodded, relieved to hear those words. Although they knew there were wounds that would take time to heal, the first step toward reconciliation had already been taken. That afternoon, the three brothers remained beside Mr. Thomas's bed, conversing, recalling childhood stories, sharing laughter and tears. Mr. Thomas, though weak, was at peace, knowing that despite the mistakes of the past, his children had finally understood what truly mattered: love and family unity. As the days passed, the siblings began to take turns being with their father, ensuring he was never alone. Luke, Joseph, and the other biological brothers began to understand that it didn't matter what success they had achieved in their lives, but rather the emotional legacy that Mr. Thomas had left them. Alexander, who had become the pillar of the family during the worst moments, continued to be the bond that kept them united. One afternoon, while the three brothers were gathered by Mr. Thomas, Alexander took his father's hand and with genuine laughter said, "Dad, I want you to know that thanks to you, I learned what it means to be a man. You gave me everything, and there is nothing in the world that can change that." Mr. Thomas looked at him with eyes filled with pride and love. "You have always been my son, Alexander," he whispered, "not by blood, but by heart." That night, Mr. Thomas closed his eyes with a deep peace in his soul. He had fulfilled his greatest mission, to leave a united family where love and forgiveness prevailed above all. He knew that although his time on earth was coming to an end, his legacy would live on in each of his children, especially in Alexander, who had understood the true meaning of sacrifice and unconditional love. That night, after sharing laughter and memories with his children, Mr. Thomas closed his eyes for the last time. The peace that enveloped him was palpable, and he left surrounded by the love and forgiveness he had always desired for his family. Alexander, Luke, Joseph, and the other brothers were by his side in his final moments. Knowing that Mr. Thomas's sacrifice had not been in vain, he had left a much deeper legacy than lands or material inheritances. When dawn illuminated the house, the void left by Mr. Thomas was immense, but the sense of having done the right thing mitigated the pain. Alexander, with a heart full of sadness, but also immense gratitude, took care of all the preparations. It was he, with the help of his brothers, who organized the funeral, an act that, in its simplicity, represented everything Mr. Thomas had been: humble, honest, and full of love. On the day of the burial, the community gathered around the Hernandez family. Neighbors, friends, and lifelong acquaintances came to say their last goodbye to Mr. Thomas, a man known for his generosity, tireless work, and devotion to his children. All the brothers were present, but it was Alexander who stood firm by the grave, holding the legacy of his adoptive father. After the burial, as family and friends began to leave, Alexander stayed a moment longer, alone by Mr. Thomas's grave. The wind gently swayed the flowers covering the spot, and the young man closed his eyes, allowing himself to feel the pain of the loss, but also something else: the certainty that he had done the right thing by returning. "Thank you, Dad," whispered Alexander to the wind, a small smile on his lips. "I promise to follow your example and take care of our family, just as you did." As months passed, the Hernandez family restructured. Alexander, who had been there for Mr. Thomas in his final moments, became the emotional pillar of the family. The biological brothers, now closer than ever, accepted him as an equal, recognizing his sacrifice and love for their father. Alexander decided to return to the family home. The fields that Mr. Thomas had once worked were now his responsibility, and he dedicated himself to caring for the land with the same dedication his father had shown all his life. Every furrow he plowed, every plant that grew reminded him of Mr. Thomas. The house, which had been empty and silent for a time, was once again filled with life. Luke, Joseph, and the rest of the siblings began to visit the house more frequently. It was no longer just an obligation, but a genuine desire to be together, to maintain the bond that Mr. Thomas had cultivated over so many years. The tensions that had once separated them now seemed absurd, and they all finally understood that family was what mattered most. One day, Alexander received news that would change his life forever. His wife, Mariana, with whom he had married a couple of years ago, was expecting a child. The announcement filled Alexander with deep emotion. He was going to be a father, and with that, he understood the cycle of life more fully. Everything Mr. Thomas had taught him would now take on new meaning. When his son was born, Alexander decided to name him Manuel, in honor of the man who had made him the person he was. Little Manuel was welcomed into a family that, though it had gone through moments of tension and pain, was now united and stronger than ever. Years passed, and Alexander never stopped remembering Mr. Thomas in every important decision, in every moment of doubt. The memory of his adoptive father was present, guiding him. Mr. Thomas had not left a material inheritance, but the legacy of his love, his sacrifice, and his loyalty to the family was invaluable. One day, while walking through the fields with his young son, Alexander stopped in front of the great tree beneath which he had had so many important conversations with Mr. Thomas. The wind gently blew, and the sound of the leaves moving in the air reminded him of his father's teachings. "Dad, everything I am, I owe to you," thought Alexander, looking at the horizon. "You promised you would always be with me, and I know that you are." With his gaze set on the future, Alexander knew he had fulfilled the promise he had made to Mr. Thomas. He had returned in time, he had protected his legacy, and now, as the father of his own son, he would continue to pass on those same values he had learned in his childhood. Unconditional love, sacrifice for those you love, and the importance of being present for family. The story of Mr. Thomas and Alexander did not end with his death. His legacy continued through Alexander's actions, who had understood that true triumph in life was not in material wealth, but in the love you share and the impact you leave on those around you. Thank you for joining us until the end of this exciting story. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more content filled with emotion and lessons. Leave your comments down below. We want to know what you thought of this ending. Your support is essential for us to keep bringing stories like this. So hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our future videos. Every like, subscription, and comment helps us continue sharing these stories with more people. Thank you for being part of this community, and we'll see you in the next video.